Alrighty, good evening and welcome to the virtual California African American Museum. My name is Alexandra Mitchell and I'm the Manager of Education and Public Programs here at CAM. I'm delighted that you've chosen to spend part of your evening with us and two of the nation's leading voices in the worlds of literature, arts, and culture. Before I begin tonight's introduction, I would like to send a big thank you to a few people who helped to make tonight possible: Lyndon King and Gwyneth Stanfield at Penguin Random House, Monet Dixon, and Catherine McKinley. I would also like to thank our book vendor partner for the evening, SO1 Books, and hope you all purchase a signed copy of tonight's text via their website. I think I speak for many of us when I say that we fell in love with Wilkerson's canonical text, The Warmth of Other Suns. Wilkerson took us on a literary journey that filled our homes with memories and thoughts of our ancestors while exploring the roots and routes of African American life in our country. In a recent interview with NPR's Terry Gross, Wilkerson noted that she realized she was writing about a caste system and not just the Great Migration while working on a warmth. In this new immersive narrative entitled Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, Wilkerson exposes how America has been shaped by a caste system, a rigid hierarchy of human rankings and divisions. Linking the caste systems of America, India, and Nazi Germany, Wilkerson explores 8 pillars that underlie caste systems across civilizations. Tonight's conversation, a focus on the text and its relation to the US, will point to many of the ways in which the text examines caste and race in the lens of what Wilkerson calls the architecture of division. Recently selected by Oprah Winfrey for her Notable Book of the Month Club, the text is already making a large impact across the nation. Cultural theorist and philosopher Kwame Appiah noted in his New York Times review of Caste that what distinguishes Wilkerson is her grasp of the power of individual narratives to illustrate such general ideas. Still, he notes, Caste will spur readers to think and to feel in equal measure. It is my hope that tonight's conversation will cause us to do just that, as we stand in a moment of reckoning in relation to race within our country. To quote Wilkerson in Caste, like other houses, America has unseen skeletons. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Jacqueline Woodson, the recipient of the 2020 Hans Christian Andersen Award, the 2018 Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award, and the 2018 Children's Literature Legacy Award. The 2018-2019 National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, her New York Times bestselling memoir, Brown Girl Dreaming, won the National Book Award, as well as the Coretta Scott King Award, a Newbery Honor, and the NAACP Image Award. She also wrote the adult books, Red at Bone, a New York Times bestseller, Another Brooklyn, a 2016 National Book Award finalist. In addition, her dozens of books for young readers include the New York Times bestseller, Harbor Me, Newbery Honor Award winners Feathers, Show Way, and After Tupac and Dee Foster, and picture books including Each Kindness and The Day You Begin, which both won the Jane Addams Children's Book Award. Isabel Wilkerson, Isabel Wilkerson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and National Humanities Medal, is the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestseller, of course, The Warmth of Other Suns. Her debut work won the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction and was named to Time's 10 best nonfiction books of the 2010s and the New York Times list of the best nonfiction of all time. She has taught at Princeton, Emory, and Boston universities and has lectured at more than 200 other universities and colleges across the United States and in Europe and Asia. We invite you to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screens for discussion following the conversation. We look forward to welcoming you back to CAM when it's safe, but in the meantime, please do take advantage of our virtual resources, public programs, and family workshops. Without further ado, Jacqueline Woodson, Isabel Wilkerson.
Thanks so much, Alexandra, and thanks, CAM. Thank you so much, Isabel, for joining me in conversation. I'm so excited to talk to you. I also want to thank the indigenous people whose land we're walking on here in New York City. It's in New York, it's the Lenape, and wherever everyone else is. I'm not going to blow up everyone's locations, but we're thankful for this land to stand on. And I am so thankful to be walking this world with you, Isabel. I know your work has changed many lives, and Caste has blown my family away, is in the process of blowing my family away in the same way that The Warmth of Other Suns did. I truly, truly believe Brown Girl Dreaming would not be in the world if it wasn't for The Warmth of Other Suns. So I'm so grateful to you for that. And thanks everyone who's joining us. This is gonna be a great night. We are going to be talking about caste in the United States. I know that in the book, Isabel Wilkerson talks about caste and some other places, but we need to talk about our country, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, among many other things. So my first question for you is, I want to go back to the warmth of other suns in relation to caste. When did you decide to write The Warmth of Other Suns, and why? And how did that lead to the writing of Caste?
First, I want to thank you for doing this. I am so happy and thrilled to be here with you. I didn't know about the influence and connection between Brown Girl Dreaming and Warmth of the Suns, so it just warms my heart. I mean, it just fills me with joy. Thank you so much for telling me that. So that book, well, we're going way back, because I took 15 years on that book. And I often say if that book were a human being, it would be in high school and dating. That's how long I took on that book. So, but that grew out of hearing, hearing so very little about the origins, of my own family and all the people around me. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and it was a place where everybody there, your parents, your grandparents, everybody was from either mainly North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. And you were surrounded by it, but no one was talking about it. It didn't have a name. No one was talking about it. And then on top of that, I happen to have gone to a school that had a lot of children who were immigrants, and I would hear them talking about their experiences, about how their parents or grandparents had come from the old country with very little, and then made something of themselves. And I never felt that I had a story to say. I mean, I knew my mother had come from Georgia, my father from Virginia, but it didn't seem to have any meaning. And little did I know that I had, and almost every African American who's a product of the Great Migration, had a huge story to tell. And so, but because people weren't talking about it, I really felt that there needed to be something that allowed their voices to come through. And so that's why I interviewed 1,200 people, in a casting call for the role to be in The Warmth of the Suns, and narrowed it down to 30 and then down to the 3, and then started to hear their stories. And that's how that happened. And, here we are 10 years later.
Wow, that's amazing. And in terms of caste, one of the many things you do so beautifully, aside from the lyricism of the narrative, is you point us toward ourselves in this way. And at the beginning of the book, you talk about a man, Auguste, tell me his last name.
Landmesser.
And can you just tell us a little bit about who he was and why he opens Caste?
Yeah, so he was a worker at a factory in the 1930s as the Third Reich was coming into being, had just established, and he's standing in the crowd of people surrounded by other workers, all of whom are extending their arm and hailing Hitler. And he alone is the one person in the sea of people, the one person whose arms are crossed and refusing to salute, to give the Hitler salute. And you think about the level of courage that it took for him to be the one person standing. In fact, in that picture, he is the only person that obviously we all know now, without a doubt, he was the only person who was on the right side of history. Everyone else in that picture is categorically, fatefully wrong. And so the question is, he had the courage to stand up in the face of brutality that had not even gotten to the point of what it ultimately would. And so it raises questions for all of us in any time period, any era, as to what do we stand for? When and what do we stand up for? And where do we stand in questions of injustice when we see injustice? And so he is the person who stands for all of us, and the potential in all of us to stand up against injustice wherever we might see it.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about caste.
Yes.
One thing that we know now, I don't know how much I knew it before, but caste and race are not the same thing. What is the difference between the two, and how do casteism and racism support each other?
That's such a great question. I realized I hadn't answered your earlier question about Warmth of the Suns, because there's a direct connection between that and this word that I'm using here. So I want to say that it's been out long enough, The Warmth of the Suns has been out long enough that many people have read it. And so happens that in telling that story about the flight out of the Jim Crow South of 6 million people, 6 million African Americans to the North, Midwest, and West, that I did not use the word racism in that book. There may be some people who are quoted, some scholars who might use it in a quote, but I don't use the word. And I came to that decision the more that I learned about what the people had endured, what the ancestors had endured. They had been born into this rigid hierarchy in which everything that you could and could not do was based upon what you look like. And that meant that such things like, it was actually against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. In courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a Black Bible and a separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth to swear to tell the truth on in court. That meant that the very word of God was segregated. That's how seriously the Jim Crow South took this issue, the matters of keeping people not just segregated, but one group clearly dominant over another group. That's how seriously they took it. And any breach of the caste system could mean your very life. And so I came away with the idea that this was not just racism. The word racism did not seem sufficient to capture the totality and the complete and total control over everything a person could do. Often at the expense of what was not even making sense. I mean, it was very expensive to even have, 4 of everything, a restroom for white men, a restroom for white women, a restroom for Black men, a restroom for Black women. So it was even at great expense, they were willing to maintain this hierarchy. And so I came out of that experience using the word caste. It also happened that in studying this, it turned out that there were anthropologists and sociologists who went to the South in the 1930s and 40s to study this caste systems, to study the era of Jim Crow and what life was like for people in the Deep South in the 1930s and 40s. And when they did that, they spent a tremendous amount of time as it was ongoing. I'm coming in years after the fact, interviewing people who survived it, but they were there when it was happening. And they emerged from their research using the word caste, saying this is a caste system that is in effect in the American South. And so all of those things came together in the process of working on The Warmth of the Suns. And I, rose from that research using the word caste. And then that led directly to this book, in which I decided to dig even deeper into this concept that I had used before, and now as a concept to describe what African Americans went through, and to dig even deeper to see how it manifests.
Wow. So how long after writing The Warmth of Other Suns did you begin to write Caste, or were you writing them at the same time, kind of?
No, The Warmth of the Suns was its own. That was 15 years and 1,200 people. That was its own, project unto itself. And it was only after The Warmth of the Suns came out that I then was, having to, I was talking about caste. I was using the word a lot, and it was becoming really apparent that needed to be the next book.
It's so amazing because it's such an eye-opening book in its way that once you know it, how can you not know it? Once you see it, how can you not see it? And it just hadn't been articulated with such grace and thoroughness as you do in this book. So I so appreciate you. What are some of the elements required for a caste system to succeed?
So, I find that I'm not, I feel as if I have to describe what caste is, which you had asked before. So if you would I want to answer that.
Yeah, sorry.
I feel like I'm lagging your questions. I'm sorry.
No, I'm eager. So I'm just pressing past because I figured the answer will come eventually.
No, it's on me. I'm lagging, and so I wanted to answer that to make sure I said that. So caste is an artificial hierarchy of graded ranking of human value in a society, and in that that ranking determines one's standing the respect and benefit of the doubt that are accorded a person, access to resources or lack of access to resources, assumptions of competence, for example, assumptions of criminality, all of the things that assume where a person might fit and how a person is expected to act in hierarchy that's created. And this has nothing to do, this is of no fault of anyone's. It's not, no one had any say as to where they were born in a caste system, any caste system. It's not on the basis of any actions or anything that someone does. It's being born into a particular location within an artificial hierarchy. And so caste I see as the infrastructure of our divisions. You know, the subtitle actually is there for a reason. The subtitle is the origins of our discontents, the origins of how we found ourselves in a ranking that was not determined by anyone alive today, but that dates all the way back to the founding of the country, to colonial times. And that this is an effort to unpack that idea and how it has manifested in our country, even to today.
So let's talk a little bit about how it has manifested in our country. Can you break that down for us? How caste is manifested? Why don't we start at 1619?
Why don't we just start at 1619? So that brings us to the definition, to race and what race is and how race is different from caste. So, race is the tool, the metric that the early colonists chose to use. They could have used any number of physical characteristics or characteristics at all in order to create a graded ranking of a hierarchy in order to make sure that the work that needed to be done to build a country would get done. They could have used whatever metric they wanted to. But it turned out that, with the transatlantic slave trade, and I should say even going back to the exploration of Europeans across into spaces where they had not been before, and coming into contact with people who looked differently from them, assumptions of superiority that began to percolate at that point. But it's a relatively new concept, this idea of race. Race is not something that goes back for thousands of years. It only goes back about 500 years to the exploration by Europeans of the planet, of the world beyond where they had been focused, and then of course the arrival of Europeans to this continent, to the sacred soil of the indigenous people, and then with the arrival of African, the capture of African people, and then making them, enslaving them. So it was in the process of creating what would ultimately become the United States, dependent on the cheapest labor that could be found, to build a new country that brought together people who had not been together in one space before, creating a new country with people from all over the world, but ultimately creating a bipolar caste system in which the people at the top who designed this or who created it were the English colonists. And the people, they were at the top as the dominant caste, and then those at the bottom were those who had been brought and enslaved to this country. So bipolar caste system with dominant group and a subordinate group. And then as people started to come in from outside of the originating dominant group, meaning the English, as others started to come, they had to find ways to navigate in this system. And as they arrived, they might have left where they were from as Hungarian or Polish or Irish. And then upon arriving here, assigned to a new category, relatively new category called white, which had not been a necessary identification for anyone before they came in contact with people who they then identified as being other. And that's how race evolved as a concept. We often say race is a social construct. It's not real. Well, this is an example of it, meaning that this was arbitrary. One of the things that I say in the book is that, that race is essentially a signifier of where people are assigned in the hierarchy as it was created. So what we look like has become the tool, the signal, the cue as to where one fits in the hierarchy. But they could have used any number of metrics. They could have used any other measures. I mean, they could have used, I say in the book, they could have used height, which is also a heritable characteristic. 80%, 80% of our height is dependent upon heredity, presumably. And so they could have used that. And then you could have had, tall people being on top or on bottom, or short people on top or bottom, depending upon who had prevailed in this struggle over power in this situation. And so it's an arbitrary thing. We need to remind ourselves that these are arbitrary divisions, arbitrary and artificial lines that were drawn. And this was the one that happened to be used in this one. And of course, the physical manifestation aided their effort to divide people on the basis of what is actually an infinitesimal fraction of the genetic material that makes a human being. There are very, very, very few differences between human beings. The things that make us physically different, are very, very small. So they chose a very small portion of one's genetic makeup to identify and divide people. And it could have been other things, but this is what they chose.
Wow. Sorry, I just need a moment. Which brings me to the writing of the book. What was the emotional journey like for you in diving into this as a person who lives in the United States, as a woman of color?
Thank you for asking. I mean, one of the reasons that I felt it necessary to do this is because there's a wealth of work, obviously scholarship on the Indian caste system. There's a wealth of scholarship on other hierarchies. Of course, from World War II, there's many, many volumes and trying to understand what happened in World War II in Germany. And there's a lot of information and more coming out every day about the history of this country. What I knew better than anything else that I've studied was what life was like for African Americans in the Jim Crow South, which I describe as a caste system. What I did not know was how did it manifest in other places, and what were the things that might be different. What are the things that might be parallels? What could we learn from how other hierarchies have worked elsewhere? And so a lot to pull all these things together meant, going in and doing all this, going to the countries that I was now studying, and looking at it from the lens of what I knew to be our country's history. One of the things I want to say about The One for the Sons is that after it came out, so many people would come up to me afterward and they would say, I read this book. I lived during the era when this book was, when many of these people were living. And they will say to me, I had no idea. I had no idea. I hear that time and time again, no matter the background of people. And so that meant that we have not really been fully exposed, as Americans, to our full and complete comprehensive history. And so because we don't know the history, we're not aware of how our country actually shows many of the characteristics of what could be called a caste system, because we just don't know the history. Once you know the history, then you can see the parallels and what we have in common. So I approached it first with the idea of, just trying to understand the original caste system in India, and making a trip there, meeting with people who were at different levels of the caste system, speaking with scholars of caste there and elsewhere, and both in the UK and the United States. And then Charlottesville happened, and Charlottesville was a moment of awareness, I think, for everyone. It was there that the symbols of the Confederacy and Nazism merged, and the ralliers who were protesting the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. And so that's what brought me to brought me to the idea of Germany as something that I needed to look at, because there in Charlottesville was this, this confrontation of memory of the Civil War, memory of slavery, memory of how, of what has happened in the time since then, how we should remember our history. And that's what, so that is where the protesters who brought these symbols, were carrying the flags of both the Nazis and of the Confederates, they brought that together in that space, and that's what propelled me to look into Germany as one other way of understanding hierarchy. And I made these discoveries that I never would have imagined, that it turned out that German eugenicists turned to and were in dialogue with American eugenicists in the years leading up to the Third Reich. That American eugenicists had written books that were big sellers in Germany in the years leading up to the Third Reich. And of course, the Nazis needed no one anywhere to show them how to hate or to tell them how to hate. They needed no one to tell them how to hate. But what they did was they actually sent researchers to the United States to study how the Jim Crow South in particular had subjugated African Americans, to study the laws, to study the Jim Crow laws as they were contemplating what would become the Nuremberg laws. That was just wrenching to see, wrenching to discover. I had no idea. And so it went far deeper than I'd ever expected when it came to seeing or recognizing the interconnectedness of some of this history.
Mm. It's interesting in terms of, I think sometimes writers will assume that writing nonfiction is less emotional than writing fiction. And you write to such an emotional core. And that's why I'm asking about that part of your process. I know when I'm writing fiction, if something's really heartbreaking and I'm crying as I'm writing it, like you have to feel the emotion to be able to get it on the page. And I don't see that as often in nonfiction as I do in The Warmth of Other Suns and now in Caste. And as a journalist, there doesn't seem to be distance from the narrative. You put yourself inside that narrative in such a deeply personal way. I'm thinking about the story at the airport. You could share that with the audience.
Well, I wanted to answer your question about the role of story and reaching the heart. I would say that my view is that if I'm not reaching the heart as well as the mind, then I haven't succeeded. That's my goal, is to reach both. I feel that one without the other is not a complete access to information. Information needs to come from both sources to engage us personally. And so I'm ever keenly aware and in search of the story that will make something come alive. I would much rather show you than tell you. What I do is called narrative nonfiction. And so I feel that it is much stronger. I would much rather you be, read the stories, the examples, the anecdotes, the vignettes, the scenes, and then come to your own conclusion about what it is that is happening and how it is that we can absorb it and how you feel about it. That's just very important to me. So there are many stories in there. It's just stories after story after story, metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. I mean, the Matrix is in there.
I love that. I love that. I tried to get my family to watch it after. I was like, wait a minute. I hadn't even looked at it through the gate, this history through the gaze of the Matrix, our Matrix through the gaze of our history. But I thought that was brilliant.
Writing, there was a long, intellectual rabbit hole that led me to the recognition the Matrix needed to be in there. I mean, you know how you just get started on one thing and then you see a link and you follow that, and before you know it, I was, in the Matrix, and that's how and that image of the Oracle talking to Neo was very powerful. And it was basically saying that you see all the things around us, and all of these things are actually programs. They're programs for the programs, and a whole way of thinking about how the programming affects us in ways that we may not realize because it's invisible to us. I mean, I describe Caste as being like a building, like a house, an old house, where you can't see the studs and the joists and the beams, but you know that they're there because the building is standing. And the whole purpose of the, you know, the actual walls, the plaster, and all the things that cover it are to make sure that it's functioning and that you don't see what's underneath. And that's the same with caste, where I say that, you know, race is, you know, caste is the bones and race is the skin. It's the thing you can see. And that's how, you know, that's how I came to see all of this. But yeah, my experiences have been, I should say that the experiences that I include in this book, I did not wish to include them. I was not looking to write about myself. You know, when I was trained as a journalist, as I was working as a journalist, we were not to talk about, you know, you're not supposed to make yourself a story. You're supposed to be reporting on other people. And as a narrative nonfiction writer, my goal has always been to write about others. So the idea of writing about myself is not something that I really wanted to do. I did not want to bring myself into it at all. And some of the things in there are pretty still raw and close to the one that I feel most comfortable talking about is the one where the man, I was trying to do the story while I was writing for the New York Times, and I'd called up all these people. It's a very routine story, and I'd called up all these people to be interviewed, and everyone was fine with it. I was talking with them over the phone. Everything was fine. We had a long list of people I was going to be seeing that day, and everything had gone fine until I got to the last one. And at the last one, I got there, and the establishment, this retail boutique, was open but didn't have a lot of people. There was no one in it. It was sort of a quiet time of the day, so there was no one there except for one of the clerks. And I got there, and he wasn't there. The person I was supposed to interview, the manager of the store, was not there. And so I was told just to wait for him to get there, and I waited and waited. And then the door opens, and a man is coming in. He's rushing. He's clearly in a hurry. He's trying to take his coat off. He knows he's late for an appointment. And so I go up to him because I'm thinking I got to make the most of the time. And I go up to him and I introduce myself. I say, I'm Isabel Wilkerson with the New York Times. And he said, well, how do I know that? And I'm just thinking, I am there. He's late for the appointment. There's no one else there. There's an appointment at 4:30. It's already late, and there's no one coming in. I mean, I'm the person. And so I said, well, yes. I mean, I'm Isabel Wilkerson. And so he says, well, do you have a business card? And it so happened that because it was the end of the day, I was out of business cards, and sometimes people would ask, and sometimes they wouldn't, and I didn't have any to give him. And so then he said, well, do you have some kind of ID? Could I see some ID? And I said, I shouldn't have to show you ID. I mean, I'm here to interview you. I have my notebook. I'm here ready to interview you. You have an appointment with the New York Times, and there's no one else here. I'm the only one here. And he said, well, do you have some type of ID? And I gave him my driver's license. And he said, you don't have anything with the New York Times on it? And I said, this is what I have. I mean, this is what I have. We should be interviewing now. I mean, we're wasting time. I should be interviewing you. And so he said, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to leave because the New York Times will be here any minute. And so I walked out, didn't get to interview him. Fortunately, because I had all the people I talked to, it wasn't necessary. It would have been nice. But more importantly, it stays with me as a reminder that, whatever one might achieve, however one might present themselves, at any moment, these assumptions can come in and intrude upon our everyday life. I mean, caste is, if nothing else, it's about boundaries and roles. Often used, and the example, there's a metaphor in the book about play. So in a play, there's the word caste is used for the reference to the cast in a play with all these characters. And the characters, everybody is supposed to be, they know their place on stage left, stage right, in the center stage, the people in the back, everybody knows their place. They also know their lines, they know the script. Some people know the entire script, and they know their lines. And so if you think about the word cast as a play, and then cast in the way I'm talking about it, the essential overlap is the idea of everyone being in their place and everyone playing out a role and everyone knows what the role is. And this man did not recognize me for the role that I actually was in. He expected someone who looked differently to be in the role that I had, and was so convinced of it that he asked me to leave because he felt that, you know, any moment he needed to prepare for the arrival of the person who I happened to be. So, and this is an example of how it really hurts everybody. I mean, he wanted to clearly to be in it, and there he wasn't.
I'm sure he called them and told them that the reporter never showed up too.
I have no idea what he said because I never saw him again.
and the grace of you not to name him. I mean, as I was reading, I was like, who is this? I know this man. I know this man, because what Black person has not lived this in some way, shape, or form in this country? I mean, every microaggression that we experience on the daily is part of the fact that, you know, we have been CASTED into this CASTE, and people don't expect us to behave otherwise. And you talk about that in the book, the fact that, you know, when an actor steps out of their role, you know, they get punished for this. They get thrown out of the play. You know, they don't get the rewards of behaving in the way that they're acting, the way they're supposed to act. And I just thought that was a beautiful comparison and metaphor to what's going on.
I'm wondering, I'd like to add something.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add that in some ways this is how race, what we consider traditional racism, is different from what I'm saying is about caste, because caste is about policing of boundaries. It's not necessarily emotional. It's not about, you know, necessarily hating anybody. It's not about, you know, it's not about hostility, open hostility that we often connect with, you know, traditional, the traditional racism of our foreparents. But it's now the policing of boundaries and the identifying or suggestion that, or assumption that a person doesn't belong. For example, that the two men who were waiting for a friend at a Starbucks in Philadelphia, police called on them. Is that hate? That's the sense of believing that they do not belong, believing that something is wrong, believing that they're doing something wrong. Assumptions about the role that people play. When it comes to the people who were barbecuing in a park in Oakland, that they don't belong, they're doing something wrong. They are the scapegoat caste, meaning the caste that is often accused of doing wrongdoing just for being. The idea of a man who was trying to get into his condo building in St. Louis, and a white woman actually blocked his path from getting into his own condo building. And the thing is, that was not about it was not about hate or fear of him, because it turns out she followed him when he managed to get past her to get into his building, she followed him to the elevator, rode up with him, clearly not fearful of him, rode up with him to his floor, got off the floor, and followed him to to the apartment, you know, the area where his apartment actually was, to assure herself that he actually belonged there. She took it upon herself to surveil him until he actually put the key in his door, opened his own apartment, and closed the door on her. He's taking a video the whole time. That is the kind of surveilling and policing that is a continuum from the era of when people in the dominant caste during the time of enslavement and even afterward would be deputized to surveil and police African Americans who were seen as stepping out of their place in whatever caste system, wherever they happen to be. So this is the through line that follows us. And I'm saying that casteism is in some ways the autonomic impulse to keep people in their place, to surveil and maintain the boundaries of the hierarchy that we've inherited.
You also have the metaphor about the old house and people saying, well, I didn't build that house. I think that's how you talk about it in terms of people talking about this system that we live in. It just is. It's not our fault that it exists like that. And what do you say to that?
You know, the thing is that I think it's a common observation from people who would say, you know, here we are now, We had nothing to do with what happened before. We did not enslave people. We were not, my family, people say my family wasn't even here during the time of enslavement. So what does this have to do with me? The thing is, I use the metaphor of the old house to remind all of us that, our country is an old house. An old houses always need work. The work is never done. You know that when you go into an old house, you're taking on, as soon as you finish one thing, something else needs to be addressed. And after a rain, you may not want to go into the basement to see what the rains have brought. You do not want to see it. But if you don't go in there, you're going to have to deal with the consequences, whether you look or not. Mm-hmm. Whatever is there will be there, whether you know it or not, whether you choose to see it or not. So we might as well see what it is that we're having to deal with. And with that old house, when you get in that old house, you had nothing to do with the pillars and the beams and the foundation that may have cracks in the walls of the foundation. You had nothing to do with it. But once you take possession of that house, once you were then there, the owner of the house, then it does fall on you. Whatever happened before, you had nothing to do with. As soon as you get there, you have inherited all that comes with it. The beautiful landscape, along with the plumbing that may not be what it needs to be. And it's your responsibility going forward to deal with that. Then it is your responsibility, whatever is going on and what we've inherited. And so we all are inheritors of this old house, and it falls upon, I believe, all of us to see what must be done in order to make sure that it is as strong as it can be, and to repair what needs to be repaired. And I would say that the responsibility is, society-wide, but especially for people who have not been in the midst of, have not had to bear the brunt of so much of what a caste system does in terms of the restrictions and limits on the life prospects of the majority of African Americans who've ever lived here before even our day. The people who are descended from those who were able to benefit from the government programs that allowed for people to get low-cost mortgages that were backed by the federal government, that allowed people to have the American dream from the time of, say, the 1930s into the 1960s, that specifically excluded African Americans. African Americans were specifically excluded from the American dream of home ownership because they were disqualified on site because they were African American from mortgages that would only be backed by the government if they were in neighborhoods that did not have Black people in them. So that's what redlining was, redlining the neighborhoods that Black people lived in. So the majority of African Americans who lived up until the 1960s were excluded from the most basic of the American dream. And so for people who had the benefit, or are descended from people who had the benefit of that, not because they chose to put other people down, or they had no say themselves in being able to benefit from it, but the benefits occurred. And so people who have been able to benefit from this longstanding government preferences for people in the dominant caste have a special responsibility, I believe, in helping to make the repairs to our society.
Mm-hmm. Especially when you look at one of the many consequences of that, which was generational wealth, and the fact that people were able to pass down real estate to their young people.
One thing I say is that that the idea of African Americans being mainstreamed into our society is very, very new. I don't think we contemplate really how very new this is. There was 246 years of enslavement. That's 12 generations of enslavement. How many greats you have to add to the word grandparent to begin to imagine how long enslavement lasted in this country. And then you add another 80 to 90 years of formal, legalized Jim Crow caste system segregation in the South in particular, but it had ramifications and shadow effect in the North and the West. And so for the vast majority of time that African Americans have been on this soil, the vast majority of the time they were restricted in 246 years of enslavement, followed by another nearly 100 years of a formal legal repression and subjugation. So the idea of mainstreaming and having options to move about, to have access to the kinds of jobs that people would have had the talent for, but were withheld from them, are now give us an opportunity to realize how very new this is. This is not something that has been going on for generations upon generations upon generations. It's relatively new. Within the lifespan of people who are alive today, African Americans have only recently really been given the opportunity, had the opportunity, fought for the opportunity to be able to be seen as citizens with all the rights and privileges that come with that. So this is really a very new phenomenon, if you think about it. One more thing is that enslavement went on for so long that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as African Americans had been enslaved. None of us will be alive for that. And so this shows you how, in the long arc of history, when you look along the lines of generations and centuries, we are still very new at this idea of truly incorporating people who had been consigned to the bottom for so long.
Wow. Yeah, that hit me hard.
Yeah.
There's a powerful story you share in the book of a stranger dismissing a toddler's father at a restaurant, telling the kid to go ahead and drink his juice if he wants to. Can you share it with us, why this scene is so unforgettable and how caste operates in a typical day of an American's life?
Yes, this was a father who was out with his toddler son on one of the days that they had together. The mother and father were no longer together. So this was a very special time for this very involved and very devoted father. And so he is with his little boy and he's ordered the food, and the little boy wants to drink his juice as opposed to eating the food that had been ordered. And the father said, well, no, you need to eat your food and get your nourishment, and then you can drink your juice. There was a woman that I would call dominant caste woman, who was listening as the father was telling this to his son, and the little boy began to cry because, as children will, that he wanted what he wanted. And so this woman actually got up and she went over to the father and the son and to that table, and she looked down at the little boy and she told him, you can drink your juice if you want to. You can go ahead and drink your juice, and if you want to, go ahead and drink it. You don't have to eat your food first. You can go ahead and drink it. Now, this meant that she was ignoring the father right there. She presumed upon herself to intrude upon a moment, a sacred moment. She presumed that this was, that something was amiss. And she decided to intrude upon the sacred moment to take on the role of policing and surveilling a parent and child. And this is the way that this is what I call sort of the everyday intrusions of caste. You don't even see it coming. I mean, there's so many examples in the book. I mean, that section is just one story after another of just to drive home the point of how seemingly ordinary this may be, but what an intrusion it is, and the sense of entitlement to go in and to tell a child what a parent, the opposite of what a parent has just told them to do. Mm-hmm. And this, what is that? Is that, what would we call that? And the word caste comes to mind because, again, it's about roles. It's about thing. It's about feeling entitled enough to be the surveillance for people who one presumes, this person presumed, required intervention and required someone to come in and tell them how to parent their.
Wow, it's so interesting. I remember when I first gave birth to my daughter, and with some kids, the color just doesn't seem like it's ever going to come in. And so she was very, very pale as a baby. And again, I would have dominant caste women, I live in a predominantly white neighborhood, say, you're so good with her. You're so kind with her, because so many of the women my complexion with pale children were nannies, including to the point where people would ask me, who did I work for? And so I think there are times when people don't even realize the unkindness or how deeply inside that caste system they are. But those each time I read one in the book, I was like, oh, I know this too well. So,
and the people who you're speaking about are very likely people who see themselves as good and kind people.
mm-hmm.
People who would say, a term that gets used a lot, not having a racist bone in my body and that sort of thing. This is what I mean by this is not the traditional racism of our forefathers. It's something different, and it's harder to recognize, and thus harder to fight because it's invisible, and it doesn't come from necessarily a place of ill will or even hostility. It could. That's not saying that it doesn't always, but the autonomic assumption that someone is in a particular role is, to me, the very definition of caste in all its iterations. Caste in the play and caste in this respect.
So we were talking about earlier how you get asked if you were writing about it, or told even that you're writing about a particular moment, and I want you to speak to that, about why you're not writing about a moment, how this is so much bigger than that and longer and deeper.
Well, in this era of upheaval, which is an ongoing era of upheaval, these are, we make progress and there's regression, and then we make progress and there's regression, and the American history is characterized by 2 steps forward and sometimes 3 or 4 steps backward, and then moving forward and backward. And so I think in this era of upheaval, I think we need new language. I think we need to have new ways of seeing ourselves, a new lens with which to understand and to see the infrastructure that has been there all along, but that we otherwise, and that affects us, but we've not been able to acknowledge it because we have not been able to see it. And so because it's been around for so long, we're talking 400 years, it's not a single moment. A moment might bring it to the fore, but it's underneath and underlying, and it's always there, ever present. And this is to try to shine a spotlight on it, to illuminate it so that we can find a way together through this to transcend it finally. And that's the reason why it's not one moment, because if we focus on one moment, we will never get to the essential core of it. We get focused on the moment, we deal with the moment, and then we sit and wait for something else, or people choose not to act, or they feel they can get comfortable and not realize that it's much bigger than any one moment. It's bigger than any one person. It's been going on for so long, and it's not even just only American. Maybe it could be considered part of human nature. But either way, it's hurting people, and it's time that we come together to recognize that.
I was thinking of Leah Said's book, Me and White Supremacy. And one thing she talks about in that book is being a good ancestor, in the same way that you talked about earlier with August and being on the right side of history. So I think this book is so much about how we can work to become good ancestors in the process of changing this caste system in America. And my question in that regard is, how do we begin to do the work? And part B to that is, what are you reading?
I can't wait to get to The Vanishing Half. And I have not had a chance to get to The Vanishing Half because this has just taken over my life. So I can't wait to get to that. I can't wait to get to Washington Black. There's so many books that I cannot wait to get to. And this has just taken over my life. So that's what I'm hoping to get to as soon as I can. Your other answer was, I'm trying to make sure I answer that one correctly. Is
how do we begin to do the work?
In writing this book, I present myself as the building inspector. I'm the building inspector, saying that this is an old house and there are various systems that are in need of repair, deep repair, if not renovation, if not replacement. And I'm also saying that the structure is here that we've inherited, and the structure requires our utmost attention. But when you have a house, when you buy a house and you have it inspected, the inspector does not tell you all the things that you must do. The inspector doesn't tell you what to do. The inspector describes what is wrong, so that then you as the homeowner can make the decision about how best to proceed. And that's the way that I approached this book. Is it took everything out of me just to write what I did. And I then felt that I have now, held an infrared light up to the country. I provided an X-ray of the country, and it is now up to all of us to now take it forward to figure out what to do. It will take everybody, and again, it's not one person, it's everybody. I do have some, some generalized suggestions, but I would not presume to know all the answers. It's been going on for 400 years, and it will not be one person, it will be all of us.
Will be. Thank you for that. I had one last question about that. Actually, it's from someone. What grade do you think students should be taught about the caste system in the US? And how would you introduce the subject to them? You have any idea about that?
Question. I mean, one of the things that I turn to for understanding, one way that we can measure it is with all of the research that's been done and the scholarship on unconscious bias, and ways that children become aware of difference, that they've inherited from the culture. I mean, not any one thing. I mean, there are parents who will say, we don't even talk about this at home, and suddenly, a word is said on a playground, and they're wondering where did their child hear this? So that, it's believed, it's understood that children pick up things very, very early. By the time they're 5 years old, they've been exposed to the culture, and so they can have been, it's possible that people could have been exposed by age 5 to the messaging, to the hierarchy. And if that's the case, then, whenever they're exposed to the hierarchy is when the instructions, the awareness, the guidance could begin to help children to recognize that these are social constructs. This is what has been created, but that does not make it real. I say color is a fact, but race is a social construct. Yes, there are many, many colors of human beings, but that does not mean that the differences in color are an indicator of intelligence, are an indicator of talent, are an indicator of honesty, or all the various things, characteristics that are either attached to or withdrawn to people from people based upon what they look like. I would say that as soon as children can become aware of difference is when the work should begin, because they're going to see.
It's such a good point. I forgot to ask you about the professor who told you that there were no Black people in Africa, and how that changed how you thought about stuff.
Yeah, that was actually a playwright. I was in London. I was given a talk about the warmth of the suns, and one of the people who was in the audience was a playwright, and we got to talking and struck up an acquaintanceship. And I was talking with her about continuing the discussion about caste as referred to the warmth of the suns, and she just at a certain moment she just said, that there are no Black people in Africa. Mm. And, when she said that, that makes you sit up and just, think, well, that the way that lands on the American ear, you have to think about that. And she said it with great, with conviction. And she said, and waited to hear what my reaction was. And, you're thinking, what do you mean? I mean, there's an entire subcontinent of people who we describe and consider as Black. And she said, no, they are not Black. They are people on the land. They're people in their families. They're people in their cities or villages or wherever they happen to be, but they're not Black. And they don't become Black until they get to the United States or go to the UK, which is where we were, but until then they are Yoruba, or they're Fante, Asante, whatever they are, but they're not Black. They don't need to be Black. Black is not the identifier when you are surrounded by people who may look more similar to you. And so this is a reminder that, again, this is a social construct. Race, as we now know it, only has meaning when it is set against people who are presumably different. And then that difference is then accorded meaning that then is used as a signifier of where people fit in a hierarchy. And that is how we get to where we are. So all of these things that make us sit up and take notice and use critical thinking and begin to, you know, look deeper into what we have inherited and to ask why do we feel the way that we do? Why do we use the language that we do? Why is the world constructed the way that it is?
For that. I just want to point out that I so appreciate how you answer these questions. I know I'm asking you so much stuff. And I so appreciate how beautiful both the actual book is, reading it, which I did the first time, and listening to the audio by Robin Miles, who also did the audio book, as you told me, Warmth for the Other Sons, which I listened to with my whole family at the time. I think my son was about 8, my daughter was older, and I mean 6 years older, so do the math on that. And the whole family just really enjoyed it. So in terms of thinking about that question about young people, it's a book that if kids aren't at the place where they can read it, they can listen to it, and it can be a family read, listen. I love listening to audiobooks with my kids in cars because they're held hostage, right, to both the book and the discussion. But one thing I love about your writing is it works so beautifully both ways. So thank you. I so appreciate you. And now it's time to go to some questions. I already took one about teaching kids. I just have to scroll through them because when people ask stuff I don't like, I'm just ignoring y'all. And then a lot of y'all don't have questions. So here's the thing. When I go to visit young people in schools, I tell them that the question is the thing that has a question mark at the end. And those are the ones we're going to answer. I really love the writing, and at some point someone might read it. I don't know if there's a whole lot of time to read it, and I appreciate y'all for typing that in there, but I really want the questions. I don't know if you want to answer this or if you know, but it's from Diana Chu, and it's, how can policymakers use the framework of caste to address the systemic and systematic inequality that is America today? Could a reframing with caste foster and accelerate cultural change for the better in our deeply polarized and fractured society? Is that something?
You know, I'm not a policymaker. I have I've absorbed the history. I'm a historian in presenting how we got to where we are, and I leave the policy to the people who are the policy experts. I would hope that by shedding light on what's underneath the issues that we face, it would allow us to actually get to the root of the problem as opposed to the external. I mean, one of the reasons that I describe caste as the bones and race as the skin is that you're dealing with the skin and you're not getting underneath it. So I think that my point with this is to awaken us to what is underneath, so that we can, in approaching a problem, you can't solve it if you can't see it. And I want people, and what happens after people see it, I don't have control over that. I do hope that it would allow us to see that we have so much more in common than we've been led to believe. And that the distinctions and differences are, I mean, there's often a debate about the role of class, for example, in speaking of policy. Class, is it class or is it race? And then I'm now introducing another idea, which is the embedded hierarchy underneath both. But I want to make a distinction about class versus caste. And what I say is that, you know, if caste is the bones and race is the skin, then class is the accent, the diction, the education, the way of dressing and carrying oneself, the things that we can do or that we choose to do or choose not to do to put ourselves presumably in a better position for whatever it is we're trying to do, or that we might lose or slip back because we haven't gained the education or all these external things that we can control. So I often say that if you can act your way out of it, it's class. And if you cannot act your way out of it, it's caste. And so this is why I would say that when people say that it's class, and if we could just deal with the issue of class, we will have resolved it. Well, class does not protect people who are born to the subordinate caste in the United States, this historically subordinate caste in the United States, when they go out and move about in the world, where we've seen from the viral videos that you could be a graduate student studying at Yale, you know, in your dorm room, and someone calls the police on you, and then you have to prove yourself to be the graduate student, the student who's studying, which they refuse to see. And so these are ways that in an instant, class does not account for the ways in which people can still be put in boxes and policed and surveilled to the detriment of people's health. I mean, I think health might be one of the areas that I might feel a little bit more comfortable making a comment about policy, because these caste and the consequences of the intrusions that come from out of nowhere have real consequences and effect on people's health. There's a term called weathering, in which the telomeres, the ends of the cells, shorten the more people are exposed to discrimination, exposed to assumptions and stereotypes and restrictions and other kind of things that we're describing here, that can intrude upon your daily life, can knock you off stride as you try to figure out what it is that just happened here, and can cause stresses that can really hurt people's health. This is a matter of life and death when it comes to people's health. There are many, many ways to look at it. One other thing having to do with policy is that because of unconscious bias, African Americans are less likely to get pain medication, for example, when they go to the hospital or go to see a doctor. That is because of assumptions about African Americans and pain threshold. It's assumed that African Americans do not feel pain in the same way that their white counterparts, white patients, would. And so they actually go without pain medication, or they may experience procedures that are more roughly administered because there's a view that they don't feel, that African Americans do not feel pain. On the other hand, as a result of assumptions about the people in the dominant caste, they are more likely to receive perhaps over prescription of pain medication, which has contributed to to what we now see as an opioid crisis. And had the United States recognized the health challenge that drug addiction causes, when we had the crack cocaine epidemic in the 90s, perhaps we would have been in better position to manage and to deal with and to anticipate and manage the opioid crisis that we're having now. So this has real world consequences to people when we have a hierarchy in which people are assumed to be in a particular place, assumed to be behaving a particular way because of the characteristics and the role that they're supposed to be playing. It has real world consequences for people.
Thank you. So this is a question from Thomasina, and I'm asking it because I wish we could see our audience, but we can't, and I think it's an interesting question for some audience members. Outside of being a good person, why would a privileged white person have any incentive to change the caste, system when they benefit from the way things are?
I think it's an illusion of benefit. It's an illusion of benefit. It may seem like a concrete benefit to be living in a neighborhood that's segregated and does not have, or more homogenous, and doesn't have people of many, many different backgrounds. It's an illusion when you have to travel very far in order to get to a job, because the suburban enclave, that's the place that's designated for your caste, is far, far from where the center of the city might be. Of course, now we're seeing gentrification, which is driving up prices in neighborhoods that had previously been African American, and now making housing values shoot up so much that many, many people in major American cities of any background cannot afford to live in the city. So everyone is harmed when we have great inequality and disparities that are inherited, that are connected to inherited hierarchies that we live with. There are also health effects on people who, because they have been isolated from, we have a tremendously segregated society even now, spatial segregation, residential segregation, segregation in certain kinds of fields of endeavor or work. And so because of that segregation, then that means that many people who are in the dominant caste do not really get a chance to interact with people who are in a different group. And so that means that there's a sense of isolation that may not be recognized because so much of life is centered around the needs of the dominant caste, not because they choose it, not because they had anything to do with it, but that's just the way that's the world we've inherited. And so that means that, you know, one of the great tragedies of a caste system is people don't get to know other people. It turns out that people in the dominant caste actually are so much more isolated that very, very few people in the dominant caste know people of a different background, different race, different ethnicity. Whereas people who are more marginalized, people of color, are more likely to know someone because they have to engage in order to work, in order to move up the ladder, in order to get a mortgage often, or to the various things that being in a numerical minority mean that you have to turn to people in the mainstream and the majority for much of what might be necessary. And so these are deprivations that we don't think of, but they very much exist. So because of the isolation, there actually have been studies that show that when a person has been isolated from people who they've been told are different from them, when they encounter someone who's different, they too experience health consequences. Cortisol levels will rise. The measurement of blood pressure will spike. Scholars have been able to measure the effect of being exposed to people who you otherwise have not been around very much, or the structure of your life has isolated you in ways you might not think about. So moving about in the world gets to be more stressful when you're isolated from others that we have all been told are presumably different from ourselves.
Wow.
Yeah.
So here's a question from Kimberly. Given the scrambling for diversity trainings as a result of the current upheaval around race, what are the implications for meaningful interventions or on institutional hierarchies with the conception of a caste system as opposed to a conception of the issue of race alone?
I think that they work together. I mean, I think that you have to address both. And the reason that I've written this clearly is to say a lot of attention rightfully goes to what we consider to be racism. It is real, and it endangers people, and it's toxic. It's, you know, it is a phenomenon that we have to deal with. My goal is to show that there is something underneath it, that there is even more that has to be contended with, and that unless we get at the underlying hierarchies, then we're not going to be able to resolve the manifestation of them, the signal of where people fit in the hierarchy. I'm saying that they work together, and that fixing one without addressing the other is not getting to the root of the problem.
Mm-hmm. I'm not going to even address that question. Sorry, I'm rolling my eyes at you. You know who you are, but I'm not going to say who you are. So anyway, that was not a question anyone needs to hear. What do you envision accountability looking like in bringing equity to overcome the caste system? I think I kind of asked that.
Yeah, you know, I do speak about the possibilities of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Obviously, reparations is, you know, the Warmth of the Suns was often has been cited in you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates' seminal piece on the case of reparations. So there is obviously, I have laid out in my work the history of the caste system embedded inequalities going back for generations that people have endured and people survive somehow. So the idea of reparations as have been offered to other peoples around the world, and even in our country, who suffered injustices. African Americans, the descendants of Jim Crow, not the descendants necessarily only of enslavement, but the descendants of Jim Crow, whose parents and grandparents were denied just the chance to get mortgages. yes, we have a history as a species of providing reparations for people who have been harmed by state policy, and then this is a group that is worthy and deserving of the reparations that other groups have received. That said, I also believe, though, that there should be education to go along with it, meaning, because I hear so often about the warmth of the suns where people will say, I had no idea. Then it's time to get an idea. It's time to learn and know the true history of our country, to know what we have inherited, to go ahead and inspect that house and to see what we are now having to live with. Because without being on the same page about how we got to where we are, then people will not understand why reparations are warranted, or why they would be necessary, or why they would be actually the fair and right thing to provide to people who have been systematically, legally, this was the state systematically restricting and excluding people for generations. And unless you know the true history of our country, then you won't understand why this is necessary and warranted. And that's why I think that they must go hand in hand. A new way, a clearer way, a more comprehensive way to get on the same page about our country's history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this is a question from Therese. Oh, first of all, thank you for pronouncing Ta-Nehisi's name correctly. Ta-Nehisi, everybody. I'm a Black MFA student attending a predominantly white graduate school. I'm having a difficult time with professors who offer a reading list that is limited in including persons, or especially women of color. I'm trying to also find a way to stay true to my voice, my own story as a Black woman, and deal with professors who I'm finding out aren't very helpful or encouraging. Can you offer some advice, words of inspiration to help other MFA students like me who are frustrated, especially in this time of racial tensions and Black Lives Matter?
Well, first of all, my warmest, best wishes and support to you where you happen to be. Sadly, I think that this is a circumstance that transcends, a particular campus, school, field. Whether you're in college or whether you're in a corporation, these assumptions and stereotypes, the focus in on where a person fits in the hierarchy and who is even fit to be in the canon. These are questions that we continue to struggle with. And I think that's the reason why I'm saying that this is so much bigger than anyone. That's one reason why I don't give a lot of specifics necessarily. I don't necessarily say it's this city, because we'll say, well, yeah, that city's always been like that. But this is a national challenge that we face. And so I can only say that we live in a time of great, of great excitement and promise because of the tremendous intellect and brilliance. Jacqueline here and myself, just the idea of all of the works that are coming out, all of the, creativity and genius and brilliance that's coming out, being able to have our voices heard, to be able to have social media in which to share, our opinions and views and the work that we have. I feel that in some ways there's never been a better time to be in a position to be a creator of something, to be a creative, because now there are more ways to make connections with people. There are more ways to find community, not just in this country, but around the world. So I just take inspiration from those who faced much more hostile open era of, I think about Zora Neale Hurston and what she had to overcome, and Ann Petrie, what she had to overcome in order to write The Street. I think about all of these other people who managed in much more ominous, overt times. The times that we're in are times of great upheaval, but I think that we have so much that we can turn to, and I think it's a time of inspiration for us. The era that we're in should inspire us to do whatever we can, wherever we happen to be, to fix this and address it.
And we can't forget, I'm just reading the opening from Ms. Wilkerson's book. Because even if I should speak, no one would believe me. And they would not believe me precisely because they would know that what I said was true. So we can't forget Baldwin up in those MFA programs. Talk about a writer who had so much to overcome. Thanks for that. Yeah, seek those outside sources. That space you're in is not the only space. So someone asked, how long did it take from start to finish of Warmth of Other Suns? And you said 15 years, right?
Years for that book. It's 15 years. And part of the reason for that was because in the midst of it, some of the people got sick. Some of the people, the people were already in their 80s and 70s and 80s, some in their 90s. I even met a man who turned 100 while I was in the process of talking with people. And so that was one of the reasons that went on, because there was a tremendous, that it would be a setback whenever, it was not just setback, it was gut wrenching to experience people taking ill and worse. So it was quite the project.
So Susan, these two questions are kind of interrelated. Susan and Sarah, tools to give your family and allies who want to be part of the solution and feel guilty because of their privilege. And how can we bring this discussion into the workplace?
Well, one of my goals is really one reason why I use the word caste is that I had hoped that it would be a word that, because it rings new and different to the American ear, would liberate us from the language that we know so well, language that we have heard so much that we almost can't hear it anymore. We can't hear it when the words are used. So I had hoped that this language would allow us to see and hear and connect, and to sort of jog the neurons in a different kind of way, so that it would not be something that was evoking emotion. You know, caste is not really about emotion, it's about the structure. And so the goal was to not, to free us from the negative emotions of guilt and shame and blame, but to free us to be able to see if a structure can be built by man, then it can be dismantled, adjusted, fixed by man. And this was a creation of man, not a creation of a spirit being or of God. It was a creation of man, and if it's a creation of man, it can also be dismantled and adjusted and fixed. And so that's why the goal would be to not get caught up in the emotion of it, even though, of course, I'm writing stories that would touch the soul and touch the heart, hopefully, in order to wake people up. But once awakened, hopefully once awakened, then people would be able to see past the emotion, to be able to see, I don't want to say to themselves, I don't want to live in a world with so much unfairness, to say to themselves, I want to expand and to see all that we have in common. And to, raise my children and grandchildren in a world that's fairer and thus healthier in every way. I think that my suggestion is for people who are in the dominant caste to awaken to things that they might not have had to think about before, because it wasn't necessarily touching them overtly, although it touches everybody. Policies that we have in this country that would help the working class people that don't get traction because there is resistance to them. This is a country that has very little in the way of a safety net compared to Western counterparts. And so the awareness of how it's hurting people, awareness of how it's hurting each and every one of us, then that would hope awaken people to wanting to know more. I would say, as I said before, that people, there are not enough of us that actually truly know our country's history. I am thrilled to see that so many books, Dr. Ibram Kendi's book has been so popular. All of the books that are out there that deal with racism, deal with anti-racism, dealing with the history of our country. This is a good sign, because it means that people are thirsting for information, thirsting for knowledge that they didn't have before. And so I would say that learning the history of our country, learning the old house that we live in, and listening to the people whose lives have been most affected, most harmed by the hierarchy, listening. And in some ways being willing to cede a section of the stage for those whose voices have not been heard.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions, and we haven't talked a lot about your writing process. So some people want to know, how do you enter a book? How do you begin? How do you keep going? How do you write?
Well, I start out with an open mind. I mean, I have an idea of looking at the issue of caste, so I'm doing that. I go to do a tremendous amount of research before I sit down. Sitting down to actually do the writing is, often comes late in the process. In my view, sometimes too late, later than I wish it would. I am trying to gather up as much as I can. I'm talking to as many people as I can. I'm taking in story. I'm taking in experiences. I'm experiencing things. I mean, it's data and inputs from all possible sources, from poetry to anthropology and everything in between. There's nothing. There's no field of endeavor that is beyond the potential for being helpful in shining light on whatever it is that I'm studying. The Warmth of the Suns, for example, had a lot of epigraphs throughout the book that were poetry and sections of people's letters that were testimony to what was going on. So I'm looking in all sources that I possibly can. At a certain point with each book, I was ordering books from all over the world and reading nearly a book a day sometimes in order to absorb what needed to be absorbed and understood in order for me to distill all that I was hearing and learning into one document. And then when it comes to the writing, a lot of times in this case, I actually had music that I was having to listen to get me through, because it was very, very intense work to get this book done. So I had from Philip Glass to Parliament Funkadelic, I was listening to. So, I was listening to whatever I needed at the moment to get me through that moment.
Oh man, do you have one of those crazy playlists? People are always asking me to make my playlist public. I'm like, you'll never read me again if I do. So
no. I include a little bit in the acknowledgments because I found them to be strangely just emerged as necessary. I didn't choose them. It was sort of out of the blue that they came to me when I needed them. And so it's a range of music that I do mention, but not a playlist, no.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm so sorry we didn't get to so many of the questions. It's been such a joy to talk to you.
Thank you so much. You've been magnificent and I've so enjoyed it. Thank you for all.
Get some lost.
Thank you.
Phenomenal. Thank you to you both for such a generous and incredible conversation. We've had a number of thank yous and generous notions of gratitude in the comments and in the question and answer. And so everybody, I hope you purchase the book. As we mentioned, please do follow both Jacqueline and Isabel on Instagram. And check out both of their websites. Isabel has a number of other talks this week, so we hope that you'll enjoy her brilliance there. Also, keep your eye out for some new work by Jacqueline very soon. Just thank you both so much. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope you stay healthy and stay well, and we look forward to seeing you back at CAM, hopefully sooner than later.
Okay, thank you.
Everybody have a great night.
Bye, good night.
Thank you so much. Take care. Hope to talk with you soon.
Definitely. Brilliant.
Okay.
Congrats again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.